She was left pregnant in a snowstorm. The wagon wheels disappeared into the white distance, carrying away the last echo of her husband's cruel laughter. Sarah pressed her swollen belly against the frozen pine bark, feeling the baby kick as if sensing the danger outside. Her breath came in silver clouds. The wedding ring on her finger had already turned her skin blue from the cold. The wind howled through the canyon like a wounded animal. Snow fell in thick curtains, erasing her footprints as quickly as she made them. She stumbled forward, her worn boots slipping on the icy ground. Each step sent sharp pains through her back. The baby was coming soon. Too soon. She had trusted him, believed his promises of a new life in California. Instead, he had taken her money, her dignity, and left her to die in the wilderness. The realization cut deeper than the mountain wind. Her fingers were numb now. She could barely feel the rough bark of the trees as she used them for support. The world had become a blur of white and grey, punctuated only by the dark silhouettes of pine trees reaching toward the colourless sky. In the distance, smoke rose from a hidden chimney. Sarah forced herself to move toward it, her legs trembling with exhaustion. The cabin appeared through the snow like a mirage, its windows glowing with warm amber light. She collapsed against the wooden door, her fist barely strong enough to knock. The door opened slowly. A tall man with weathered hands and eyes the color of storm clouds stood in the doorway. He wore a thick wool coat and carried the scent of wood smoke and leather. His beard was streaked with silver, and deep lines marked his face like a map of hard winters. He looked at her swollen belly, then at her face, blue with cold. Without a word, he stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. The warmth hit her like a physical force, making her legs buckle. She had found shelter. Whether she had found salvation remained to be seen. The man caught her arm as she swayed, his grip firm but gentle. His calloused hands spoke of years working with rope and steel, yet they trembled slightly as he guided her to a chair beside the stone fireplace. The flames danced between them, casting shadows that made his weathered face appear younger, more vulnerable. He poured hot coffee from a blackened pot, the steam rising between them like prayers. She wrapped her frozen fingers around the tin cup, feeling life slowly return to her hands. The coffee was bitter and strong, tasting of smoke and solitude. "Name's Thomas," he said finally, his voice rough from disuse. "Thomas Reed." She nodded, unable to speak past the gratitude lodged in her throat. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask about the baby or the man who had left her. His silence felt like kindness, like understanding born from his own hidden wounds. Through the window, the storm continued its assault on the mountain. Snow piled against the glass, creating a cocoon of warmth and safety within the cabin walls. The fire crackled, filling the silence with its ancient song. Thomas moved around the cabin with practiced efficiency, preparing a simple meal of beans and cornbread. His movements were economical, precise, like a man who had learned to live with the bare essentials. Yet there was tenderness in the way he set the plate before her, in the careful distance he maintained so she wouldn't feel trapped. She watched him from beneath lowered lashes, noting the way his shoulders carried some invisible weight, the way his eyes never quite met hers directly, the way he touched his left ring finger, though no band adorned it. They were both haunted, both broken in ways that couldn't be mended with words or promises. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, and she gasped, her hand flying to her belly. Thomas looked up sharply, concern flickering across his features. "How long?" he asked. "Soon," she whispered. "Maybe days." He nodded slowly, his gaze moving to the storm beyond the windows. They both knew what that meant. No doctor for miles, no midwife. Just a pregnant woman, a mountain man, and the approaching birth that would test them both. That night, he gave her his bed and slept on the floor beside the fire. She lay awake, listening to his steady breathing, marveling at this stranger who had opened his door to her without question. In the darkness, she allowed herself to weep quietly for all she had lost and for the unexpected grace she had found. The days blurred together like watercolors in the rain. Thomas cared for her with a devotion that asked nothing in return. He chopped extra wood so the cabin stayed warm. He prepared meals with ingredients she suspected were meant to last him through winter. He spoke little, but his actions spoke volumes. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, the silence between them comfortable now. Sometimes she would catch him watching her, his eyes holding a tenderness that made her chest tight with unnamed emotion. He would look away quickly, but not before she glimpsed the loneliness there. One morning, she woke to find fresh wildflowers beside her bed, their purple petals dusted with snow. He must have ventured out before dawn to find them, risking the cold and wind to bring her something beautiful. She pressed the flowers to her face, inhaling their sweet fragrance, and felt something shift inside her heart. They began to talk, tentatively at first, then with growing trust. He told her about his traplines, the wildlife that shared his mountain. She spoke of her childhood in Virginia, her love of books and music. Neither mentioned their wounds, but understanding grew between them like seedlings pushing through spring soil. She learned that he carved intricate figures from pine wood, his large hands capable of incredible delicacy. He learned that she could sing, her voice filling the cabin with melodies that seemed to ease the tension from his shoulders. The baby grew heavier, more restless. Thomas made a cradle from smooth pine boards, working by lamplight with infinite patience. When she discovered it one morning, perfectly sanded and lined with soft rabbit fur, tears spilled down her cheeks. "You don't even know if it's his child or mine," she whispered. Thomas set down his carving knife and looked at her directly for the first time. "Don't matter whose seed it came from. What matters is who tends the garden." On the seventh day, the pains began in earnest. Thomas had delivered calves and foals, but never a human child. His hands shook as he boiled water and gathered clean linens. Sarah gripped his forearms during the contractions, her nails leaving crescent marks in his skin. He didn't flinch. "I'm scared," she gasped between waves of pain. "I know," he said softly, "but you're stronger than the fear." The storm outside seemed to mirror her labor, wind howling and snow battering the windows. Hour after hour passed, her cries mixing with the sound of the gale. Thomas never left her side, his presence steady as a lighthouse in a hurricane. When the baby finally came, slipping into the world with a cry that silenced the storm, Thomas caught the tiny body in his careful hands. The infant was perfect, small but whole, with a shock of dark hair and fingers that grasped at the air. "A girl," he said, his voice thick with wonder. Sarah reached for her daughter, and as she cradled the baby against her chest, she looked up to find Thomas watching them both with such naked longing that her breath caught. In that moment, she understood. He wasn't just a rescuer or a reluctant host. He was a man who had been waiting his whole life for this moment, for this family he had never dared to hope for. The next morning brought devastating news. Through the cleared windows, Sarah spotted riders approaching through the snow. 5 men on horseback, led by a figure she recognized with a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Her stepfather, Martin Caldwell, his face twisted with the same cruel determination that had driven her from home. Thomas saw them too. His jaw tightened as he reached for the rifle mounted above the fireplace. "He's come for me," Sarah whispered, instinctively clutching the baby closer. "He'll take us back. Make me marry his business partner for the alliance." Her voice broke. "He'll sell my daughter just like he tried to sell me." Martin Caldwell was a man who collected debts, human and otherwise. He had adopted Sarah after her parents died in a fever outbreak, but his kindness had come with a price. When she refused his chosen husband, he had arranged for her to be taken west by men who owed him favors. Men who were told to abandon her once they had her far from anyone who might help. "They won't take you," Thomas said quietly, checking his rifle. "Either of you." Through the frosted glass, they watched Martin dismount, his expensive coat and polished boots marking him as a man unused to wilderness hardship. His men spread out around the cabin, professional in their movements. These weren't simple ranch hands. These were hired guns. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she recognized one of them, Jake Morrison, the man who had claimed to be her husband, who had taken her money and left her to die. He had been working for Martin all along. The knock on the door came hard and demanding. "Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore." Martin's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to obedience. "I know you're in there, girl. Come out now, and we'll discuss this like civilized people." Thomas looked at Sarah, his storm grey eyes asking a silent question. She nodded, understanding. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. He opened the door, but didn't step aside. Martin stood on the threshold, his pale eyes cataloguing the cabin's interior, noting the cradle, the signs of recent birth. A cruel smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Mr. Caldwell," Sarah said, standing behind Thomas with the baby in her arms. "I wondered when you'd come calling. You've caused me considerable trouble, Sarah, and expense." Martin's gaze shifted to Thomas. "I don't know who you are, Mountain Man, but this woman belongs to me. She's my ward, contracted to marry a business associate. That child she's holding, it's bastard born, but my associate is willing to overlook that indiscretion." "I don't belong to anyone," Sarah said, finding strength in her voice. "And my daughter will never be sold like livestock." Martin's smile widened. "Your daughter? My dear girl, you seem to forget. You have no legal standing, no property, no rights. I am your legal guardian until you marry or reach the age of 25. He gestured to his men. "Now come along. We have a long journey back to civilization." Thomas shifted slightly, his body becoming a barrier between Martin and the women behind him. The lady said no. For the first time, Martin's composure cracked. "This is none of your concern, whoever you are. Sarah is coming with me, willing or otherwise. That child as well." "Over my dead body," Thomas said quietly. Martin's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "That can be arranged." He nodded to his men, and hands moved to gun handles. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring. Sarah felt the baby stir in her arms, a tiny fist uncurling against her chest. This innocent life, this perfect creation, was what Martin wanted to use as a bargaining chip. The thought filled her with a fury that burned away her fear. "Wait," she said, stepping forward. "I'll make you a deal, Martin." Both men looked at her sharply. "A wager," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "You always loved your games of chance, your card games and horse races. Let's settle this like you would any other debt." Thomas turned to stare at her, but she kept her eyes fixed on Martin's face, watching calculation replace surprise. "What kind of wager?" Martin asked, intrigued despite himself. Sarah took a breath, knowing she was about to gamble everything on a desperate hope. "Single combat, your champion against mine. If your man wins, I'll come willingly. But if mine wins, you leave us be, forever. You tear up whatever papers you think give you claim to me, and you never come back to this mountain." Martin's eyes gleamed with interest. He had built his fortune on such wagers, always ensuring the odds favored him. "And who, pray tell, would be your champion?" Sarah looked at Thomas, seeing the understanding dawn in his grey eyes. "Thomas Reed will fight for me." Jake Morrison stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun handle. "I'll take that bet, Caldwell. Been wanting to finish what I started with this bitch anyway." Martin studied Thomas with the calculating gaze of a man sizing up livestock. The mountain man was tall and broad-shouldered, but he was older, and Jake was a known gunfighter with at least 12 kills to his name. Very well, but not with guns. Too messy, too quick. Knives. First blood loses. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She had just wagered Thomas's life on her freedom, and she didn't even know if he could fight. But when she looked at him, she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the family they had become, the life they had built in 7 short days. "Agreed," Thomas said simply. They moved outside, the men forming a rough circle in the snow. The morning sun cast long shadows across the white ground, turning the scene into something from a fever dream. Sarah clutched her daughter, whispering prayers to whatever gods might be listening. Jake drew a long hunting knife, its blade catching the light. He moved with the fluid confidence of a professional killer, circling Thomas like a predator stalking prey. Thomas pulled his own knife from his belt, shorter but wickedly sharp. He held it low, his stance defensive, patient. He watched Jake's eyes, not his blade, and Sarah remembered something her father had once told her about truly dangerous men. They were the quiet ones, the ones who didn't need to prove anything. Jake struck first, a lightning-fast thrust aimed at Thomas's heart. But the mountain man wasn't there. He sidestepped with surprising grace, his own blade flicking out to score a thin line across Jake's wrist. First blood. Jake stared at the cut in shock, then at Thomas, who stood calmly waiting. "That's not possible," Jake breathed. "Possibility's got nothing to do with it," Thomas replied quietly. Martin's face had gone pale. "The wager stands," he said through gritted teeth. "You've won this round, Sarah. But don't think this is over. There are other ways to collect what's owed." "No," Thomas said, his voice carrying a note of finality that made everyone turn to look at him. "There aren't." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper, yellowed with age. "Recognize this, Caldwell." Martin's eyes widened as he saw his own signature at the bottom of the document. "Where did you get that?" "From your desk, 20 years ago, before I became Thomas Reed." He looked at Sarah, his eyes soft with old pain and new love. "My real name is Jonathan Whitmore. I'm Sarah's uncle, her father's younger brother." The world tilted on its axis. Sarah stared at the man who had saved her, trying to reconcile this revelation with everything she thought she knew. "But Papa said you were dead, killed in the war. I was supposed to be. Would have been easier if I had been." Thomas's voice was heavy with old grief. "I came home from Antietam to find your parents dead, our farm sold, and you gone." Caldwell had covered his tracks well. "I spent 5 years looking for you before I gave up and came to these mountains to die." He turned back to Martin, and Sarah saw something terrifying in his expression. "This document transfers guardianship of Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore to her next of kin upon her parents' death. That would be me, not you, which means every contract you signed, every arrangement you made is null and void." Martin was backing toward his horse, his men shifting nervously. They had signed on to collect a runaway ward, not to face a man with legal claim and nothing left to lose. "You can't prove any of this," Martin sputtered. "I can prove enough. And I've got friends in the territorial court who remember the Whitmore name." Thomas folded the paper carefully and tucked it away. "Leave now and don't come back. Ever." As the riders disappeared into the morning mist, Sarah felt the last shackles of her old life fall away. She looked at Thomas, at Jonathan, at this stranger who was family, who had given her safety and hope and love without even knowing who she was. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked softly. He was quiet for a long moment, watching their daughter sleep in Sarah's arms. "Because it didn't matter who we used to be, only who we chose to become." The baby stirred, making soft mewing sounds. Sarah looked down at her daughter's perfect face, then up at the man who had become her anchor in the storm. "What do we become now?" Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "A family, if you'll have a broken-down mountain man for a husband." Sarah's answer was in her kiss, soft and sure as spring rain. When they broke apart, she whispered against his lips, "What shall we name her?" Thomas looked at the baby, at the mountains beyond, at the life spreading out before them like an unwritten page. Hope. Her name is Hope. The seasons turned. Spring brought wildflowers and wedding vows spoken beside a mountain stream. Summer brought Thomas teaching Hope to walk among the wildflowers. Autumn brought the harvest of their garden and Sarah's belly swelling with new life. Winter brought peace. In the evenings, by the fire that had first brought them together, Thomas would carve toys for Hope while Sarah sang lullabies. Sometimes they would talk about the past, but more often they spoke of the future, of the children they would raise together, of the life they were building in their mountain sanctuary. The outside world felt distant, irrelevant. They had found something more precious than gold in these high places. They had found each other. One snowy evening, as Sarah nursed their newborn son and Hope played at Thomas's feet, he looked up from his carving with eyes full of wonder. "What is it?" Sarah asked. "Just thinking about storms," he said softly. "How sometimes they don't destroy. Sometimes they deliver exactly what you need." Since that morning, the mountain never echoed with loneliness again. It rang instead with children's laughter, with Sarah's songs, with the quiet contentment of lives lived fully and love freely given. Would you have opened your door to a stranger in a storm? Tell us in the comments what this story meant to you. And if you believe in second chances, subscribe to Silent Ranch.